Hi everyone, it's Lisa. Welcome to my sewing lair. I have my video affixed to my design wall. What I'm looking at with you is the quilt project that I'm making, which is called the Flutterby Quilt, which is by Jen Kingwell, featured in her Quilt Lovely. I stumbled upon this block in doing an internet search for quilt patterns that had split rectangles in it. And frankly, there's not very many in that I could see. But when I saw this quilt, I was pretty captivated by it because you can see there's a lot of movement that's created through the combination of the split rectangles. And if you don't know what that block is, that's a split rectangle and that's a split rectangle. And a complete block is simply this block here, which is comprised of, I call this a nexus square, and two split rectangles, but these are mirrored units. And then coupled with a 4-patch that has color on the outside and neutral fabrics on the inside. So you can see the combination of these blocks together create this lovely effect. And the adjacency of the pattern gives you a pinwheel, two split rectangles. That square is static throughout, and it does provide the eye an immediate visualization of the pattern. The 4-patch, which is an integral component to the block, has a colored square on the outside and then more neutral fabrics comprising the other 75% of the block. And what that allows you to get is this movement that you see here. So if you had a lot of color there, that wouldn't work so well. So any place where you can have low volume prints that read as a neutral would work really well with this pattern. I had a variety of blocks that I felt like would work well, or rather a variety of fabrics that I thought would work well in the purple and blue with some green. And this is part of my Swedish death quilting to get rid of some of the fabric that I have accumulated. My goal is to make a quilt for my sister. And I was experimenting with these blocks, and this is what I have come up with. For those of you of a certain age, you may remember your mothers reading True Confessions, that smutty little book from the 70s, that little magazine. And my true confession here is this block has given me an enormous amount of trouble, and I realize why. While this looks very simple for those of us who have, I was calling it spatial dyslexia. And I just put those two words together. I was writing about it on my blog post. And I just had no end of problem getting my triangles the right way. And I spent a lot of time with my Havel seam ripper because I thought I had put it together correctly. It looked correct to my eye, but in fact, it was not correct. It was, inside out and upside down. So essentially what I had to do is just, take one of these squares, completed blocks, and whatever block I was looking at, I just had to do the rotation. Now, the other thing that's important is that this split rectangle block really requires a lot of accuracy if you want to get good points on it. And I would highly recommend that you look at my video on making split rectangles and go ahead, if you're going to try a pattern like this, to get a ruler that allows you to oversize and trim down so that you can get the perfect join. So as I was lamenting my problems with the block, I frustratingly called it spatial dyslexia. And what I later found out, I said, well, geez, if I'm putting these two words together, I'm wondering if it really is such a thing. Well, it is a thing called directional dyslexia. And I'll put a link to the website on this. And I indeed read the description of directional dyslexia, and so many things in my life became clear to me. It is a problem with left and right, and I cannot flip those things in my head. I've never been able to, and it also explains why I like my EQ8 so much, because I can do those flips and see it, and visually know that I'm right. So I did this painful dissection. Like, for example, when I was telling you what these rotations were, it may seem very obvious to you, and it's obvious to me when I look at it, but when I'm physically putting it together, it was, I kept flipping, I kept getting these wrong. I would put this one here and that one there, which made for, a much different, angle on the quilt, and would be, I don't even know what that would look like. I might, diagram that out in EQ8. But I was literally almost in tears. I rarely have to rip seams out. I'm generally, pretty careful about what I'm doing. A lot of that is because I don't make things too complicated. And I don't mean to say that this is a complicated block, but to my brain, it's complicated. So some strategies to overcome that simply is to make a test block and make sure it's the right test block. And then I would simply, when I'm ready to go here, I take this block and I turn it, and then I make sure that I have, the correct split rectangles there. And when I'm doing this block, I do the same thing. I rotate that block and make sure that I've got these the exact same way. There's a lot of good reasons for making a test block, and one of which is what I'm demonstrating here. But I also want to talk about very quickly the other aspects of making a test block. There is much said about having a perfect quarter inch, and I want to make a distinction here that was not readily apparent to me when I started quilting. And I started quilting in mid 2019, so I don't present myself as an expert. Rather, I present my work here as a quilter kind of trudging through and learning this excellent craft and trying to get a little bit better about it and share my journey with you. So I'm just reflecting here what I've learned and what might be helpful to you. And what I learned about seam allowances is this. It's like chasing a unicorn. Yes, there is a perfect quarter inch seam allowance, but I'll tell you where it matters and where it doesn't matter. If you are making a block that you are trimming down to size, so you have oversized units and you're trimming it down to size, whether or not you have a perfect quarter inch seam really doesn't matter. So for example, in making this 4-patch, if you are utilizing, and there are methods that use an oversized method, I don't use them for 4 patches, but you don't need a perfect quarter inch because you're your line on your ruler is going to line these up for you, and you're going to perfectly trim around so that each of these units, including the seam line, are trimmed to perfection. Okay? If you're not using a trim down template, then if you have a perfect 1/4 inch seam, your block may not finish the way you expect. And it's for these two factors. It's your substrate and your thread. Not every fabric behaves the same way. It doesn't sew the same way. It doesn't press the same way. So the combination of your fabric and the combination of your thread and your pressing technique will all determine whether or not you need something different than a 1/4 inch seam, and that is called the scant 1/4 inch seam. Now, a scant 1/4 inch seam is essentially taking into account the fabric fold and your thread, which all gets caught up in the fold. So if you press your seams open, and I do not, you may be fine with a perfect 1/4 inch because you're flattening that seam out. If you're like me and pressing it over, and I need a scant 1/4 inch, otherwise my block doesn't finish correctly most of the time. But sometimes if I do a scant 1/4 inch, I end up with a block that's too long or wide. And that's why it's important to make your test block. So I made, using my fabrics here, I made a test block 4 patch to make sure that these 3.5 inch cut blocks finish at 6.5 inches. And I needed a scant 1/4 inch to do that. And my scant 1/4 inch is essentially about, a click over from the center of where the needle hole is. All right. So if you're trimming down, your perfect 1/4 inch is fine, and you can be proud of that. But if you're not, you need to understand the composition of your blocks and what seam allowance you need to do on your machine with your thread, your fabric, and your pressing technique to get the block outcome that you're looking for.